So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first of our series of Behavior Basics. Today we have Dr. Kevin Quinn from the State University of New York at Albany, who's a consultant to the PBIS TAC with us. He is the chair of the Department of Counseling Psychology. I don't know why they go first. Counseling Psychology and Education. I got your title.
They don't. Educational and Counseling Psychology.
Yeah, so now education's first. Can I start the recording again? No, I'm okay. Kevin is going to be presenting. So right now you should see the screen of Kevin, and I'm going to turn it over to you if you'd like to do a brief introduction better than what I did.
Thanks, Erin. The purpose of today, I'm sure for some of you, much of the material might be new, and for others it might be reasonably sort of old hat, but it's to ensure that all of us who are part of this endeavor are on the same page with regard to our understandings of both the theoretical underpinnings of PBIS as well as the practical applications. And that when we work with schools, with one another in supporting anyone's behavior change, really, whether they are adults or children, we're thinking in a theoretically sound way that, in fact, we have a defendable theory of action. And towards that end, we're going to spend the time taking a look at the applied behavior analytical roots of PBIS. The goals of the webinar are to review how PBIS is an applied example of behavioral theory and how it evolved from the discipline of applied behavior analysis. It's actually a very interesting story. At least I found it very interesting. And examine the ways in which ABA provides a sound theoretical foundation for the evidence-based interventions and supports provided at each tier of the PBIS framework. A theme that I'll probably come back to frequently is sometimes when we do FBAs and BIPs for students who need Tier 3 supports, that behavioral theory is made very explicit through the conducting of the FBA and the BIP. But the fact is that same behavioral theoretical framework is the foundation on which interventions at Tiers 1 and 2 are based, and so part of the goal today is to make that explicit, how that works. So some wag at some point, this old wine, new bottle is a phrase you often hear tossed around, but PBIS is sometimes referred to as old wine in a new bottle because it is in fact an application of a theoretical approach that's 80 or 90 years old, and applied behavior analysis. Some people trace its real genesis to an article from 1968, I think. We'll see in a minute. So, to the extent that 1968 makes something old, PBIS is really just a system-wide packaging of applied behavior analytic principles. And the sequence goes something like this. We start with behavioral theory, science of behavior, which was inductively. If you want to have, I could refer a half an hour on inductive versus deductive, but I won't. Experimental analysis of behavior. It's an inductive approach whereby the theory was actually developed via the experimenting instead of testing the theory that was developed ahead of time with experiments. So experimental analysis of behavior, you can think of Skinner's box. Which in turn gave birth to applied behavior analysis when the lawful principles of behavior were identified through experimental analysis of behavior. There were researchers and scholars and practitioners who were very bold and went out into the real world and took those principles with them and applied them to real-life situations. Out of ABA came PBS, in what proves to be, in my mind, a very interesting story, something of a soap opera, actually, professional soap opera, that led to rifts in the field. And in turn, school-wide PBS, or PBIS, is an articulation of the broader category of positive behavior support. If I had room for another circle there, I would put, at least speaking to the behavior specialists on the line, and Aaron and me and Heather, jobs, because it's really that sequence I've just articulated that led to the nationwide spread of PBIS, including here in New York, the investment in the PBIS infrastructure in New York, and therefore the existence of the behavior specialist jobs. So really one of the things we're going to do today is trace the story of how your jobs came to be. The major grand poobahs of PBIS, Ralph Horner and George Sagai, have indeed made it explicit that school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports is an example of applied behavior analysis implemented at a scale of social importance. In this case, that's the school and the classroom. So as such, it's critical that those of us who wish to implement or support the implementation of PBIS be explicitly clear as to how PBIS is an example of ABA. Okay, I'm pausing. Anybody there?
Yep, I don't see any questions yet.
Okay. So if we go back to this one, what I'm going to do is walk us through that cascade of ovals. There'll be slides for each of those ovals. I'll go through the ones at the beginning, hopefully quickly, because we really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the basics of ABA and how it relates to PBIS. So it starts with behaviorism, the philosophy of the science of behavior, and it's committed to three truths: that psychology is the science of behavior, not the psychology of the mind; that behavior can be described primarily without making any reference to hypothetical constructs such as mental events or internal psychological processes; that the sources of behavior are external, that is, in the environment, not within the person. And that's pretty revolutionary, by the way, for psychology. Early behaviorists were, and their inductive approach were quite at odds with other theories of psychology that were deductive in nature and developed theories that were then tested. In the course of theory development in psychology, if something is explained with a mentalism or a hypothetical construct, the onus is placed on describing that in operationalizing those terms in observable and measurable terms. So those are some defining characteristics of behaviorism. Again, behaviorism was, because it was inductive, it wasn't a theory that existed a priori or in advance. It actually emerged from the observations made by behaviorists. Rather than start with theory and then conduct observations, it started with observations, and then the theory was built off of those observations through the process known as experimental analysis of behavior. It was named as a new science by Skinner, and indeed it was a revolutionary departure from most theoretical theories of psychological theories. It outlined specific methodology for its practice. Over time it did. The rate or frequency of a response of behavior is the most commonly measured outcome of concern. Repeated or continuous measurement is made in carefully defined response classes. Response classes is specifically a behavioral term, or a term related to behavior theory that just means behaviors that look the same that look different topographically, but in fact occur under the same conditions in order to provoke or evoke the same consequences. A student might tap his pencil, click his tongue, snap his fingers when left alone in order to get teacher attention. All of those manners of making noise constitute a response class. Single subject experimental comparisons, I'll show you some more of that later on, are used instead of designs that lead to statistical group comparisons between experimental and control groups. Those are defining characteristics that emerge from experimental analysis of behavior. A couple more. Specific methodology for its practice. Visual analysis of graph data is preferred over statistical inference, and the description of functional relations is valued over formal theory testing. This is a display of graph data. It's a simple AB design. Don't let those references to ABA confuse you with applied behavioral analysis. It's just labeling of the different phases of the experiment, with the first A being baseline, the B being intervention, the second A being return to baseline, and the second B being return to intervention. This is perhaps the simplest of the ABA designs, the single case designs, but it does some interesting things, right? It is, in fact, provides a visual analysis of graph data, and it shows experimental control because the baseline data are relatively steady, and then we see an intervention effect when the intervention is in place. During B, we withdraw the intervention, and we see the return to near baseline conditions. We introduce the intervention again, and behavior improves again. And it's through this methodology that behaviorists demonstrate experimental control, and in that they demonstrate that behavior does in fact have a functional relationship to the environmental conditions that are being manipulated to surround that behavior. Of course, if you can imagine, let's imagine that these data were for something they're not. They're for fulfilled assignments, but imagine they were for self-injurious behavior. You can understand why returning to baseline might create ethical conditions if the person was smashing their head into the wall. And so there are many other designs that don't require this reversal, but that's a reasonable, simple articulation of how research data were presented in a different manner than group designs that rely on statistical inferences. There he is. Skinner and colleagues conducted, would you like to know the story? All right, so Skinner, here's the deal. Skinner had a student named Pennypacker. Pennypacker had a student named Rep. Rep had a student named Quinn. Quinn, you're now studying with Quinn, so there's your direct pipeline back to Skinner. How about that? I can do that for Freud too, but that's a different story for a different day. Skinner and his colleagues conducted many laboratory experiments over 20 years. They discovered and verified in that inductive way I mentioned the principles of operant behavior that defined behaviorism, and the same principles continue to provide the empirical foundation for what you're doing in PBIS today. It has direct roots back to Skinnerian behaviorism and the experiments he and his colleagues conducted. Skinner, one of the big advances that you'll recognize from your own work is that Skinner distinguished between respondent and operant behavior. Respondent behaviors refer to reflexive or classically conditioned behaviors elicited by specific stimuli. It's the SR paradigm. Unconditioned ones, if you remember good old Pavlov, that's salivating when presented with food or meat. The conditioned response, he rang the bell and the dog learned to salivate. Right, he paired them and rang the bell. We all remember this from Psych 101. So when we think of the respondent paradigm, we're thinking of Pavlov's, Watson's, and Thorndike's work. And if you all remember, Watson scared the hell out of little Albert. Probably not an experiment I could get through the IRB here at the university today. And Thorndike was also interested in what he called connections between stimulus conditions and learned responses, and believed that human behavior was largely a function of connections that were performed between specific environmental conditions and behavior. Thorndike alluded to reinforcement, but it wasn't really until Skinner came along and added the consequence piece to thinking about how behavior is learned, what he called operants. This is where we, instead of just having the SR, which would be analogous to just having the AB of the ABC three-term contingency, operants were behaviors or actions acquired or learned via the three-term contingency. An individual would learn that if I allocate a given behavior under certain conditions, I'm likely to be reinforced for that behavior, so it increases the likelihood that the individual will engage in those behaviors again under the same or similar conditions because they anticipate being rewarded again, at least on some reasonable schedule. The future, so I think I've just gone through that. And the SRS, one thing behaviorists did is they invited a language that made their theory more difficult to understand than it needed to be. The SRS there is just stimulus response stimulus. I have found that many people are comfortable with the idea of an antecedent being a stimulus and are less clear that consequences can be considered stimulus too. So that SRS is really an analogous way to refer to the ABC paradigm. And we're thinking, of course, about Skinner's work here. Skinner worked with animals, rats, pigeons, to establish the learning principles that comprise behaviorism and therefore inform applied behavior analysis, which in turn informs your work in PBIS. ABI, on the other hand, focuses on a different animal. That animal would be we humans, right? So we came out of the laboratory and into the real world. Erin?
Okay, so what I'm going to have you do, Kevin, is if you can go back 4 slides, just hit previous 4 slides, and you don't have to review them, but if people can just take a moment on each of the slides. I forgot to mention in the beginning of the call that the intention is for this to sound like a college course, that we want to go back to the basics in the beginning and make sure that we all have that formalized understanding. So what questions do you have about what Kevin's talked about so far with basically the foundation or the development of applied behavior analysis? I'll give everyone a minute to think about that.
I think it's interesting because it literally is the story of how your job came to be. We're not there yet, but we'll get there.
Okay, could you advance to the next slide, please? This is where it starts to get a little bit more hairy, but for those of you who are very familiar with the behavior pathway, you can see that this is like the foundational work that was done for function-based thinking and function-based problem solving, for what we're referring to as function-based thinking and problem solving. So it's really, when you look at the operant part of the behavior, which is the right side of your screen, I think it's in pink, this is where our work, it's going to start to
look familiar.
Yes. Questions on this? Wondering?
How's my pace, Erin?
Good. We might need to slow down a little bit, but does everyone, if you agree or you think that he needs to go faster or slower, you can put that in the chat. But sometimes the phone's just cutting out a little, so you might just need to go a little bit slower. And to the next slide, please. Okay. Are we good to go so far, everyone?
I think our mouse human there, our monster mouse, sort of represents why some people are uncomfortable with and reject the principles of behaviorism, that that they resent being thought of as a black box that can be influenced. We still there?
Yep, I think you're all set to move on. I don't see any questions or comments.
All right. So in the 60s, researchers left their labs, went out into the real world to address behavioral issues. Interestingly, the fact of the matter is that more broadly within the field of psychology, behaviorism actually holds a very modest position. It is not the dominant theory in the broad field of psychology. It is, however, the dominant theory within the field of special education. And to a considerable degree, that results from the work done early on with students with autism spectrum disorders and intellectual disabilities, on whom applied behavior analysts focus much of their initial work, and through approaches like direct instruction in schools, capital D, capital I on direct instruction, that's informed by the behavioral approach with clear antecedents, student behaviors, and teacher-issued consequences embedded within the structure of DI, and certainly with classroom management systems. And so in the 60s, the field of applied behavior analysis, which really wasn't called that yet in the early 60s, really began to emerge. It came out, I was right, in 68, and Beowulf and Risley in 1968 published Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis. You should have heard angels sing when I mentioned that publication. It is thought of as the holy grail of applied behavior analysis. Bear, Wolf, and Risley are thought of as the founding fathers of a new discipline that was labeled applied behavior analysis. It defined the criteria for judging research and practice in applied behavior analysis and outlined the types and scope of work that analysts could and should do. The article, Some Current Dimensions, is the most widely cited publication in all of ABA. It might behoove you to read it. It remains a standard description of the discipline. And in 687, Bear and Wolf, I don't know, I think Todd Risley might have died by then. Some Still Current Dimensions revisited those same principles. They recommended, I'm just going to very quickly, 7 defining dimensions of ABA that it be applied. I'm going to let you read that. That it be behavioral. That it be analytic. That it be technological. That it be conceptual. That it be effective. And that it address generality. So think for a minute across those terms, read each of those items for a second, and think to yourself, does PBIS do those things? Is PBIS applied, behavioral, analytic, technological, conceptual, effective, and informed by generality? Well, Anderson and Kincaid, I suspect some of you on the phone have actually been at presentations from Don Kincaid, who's the director of PBIS in Florida. In a publication from 2005, in fact, very explicitly argued that yes, PBIS does address all of these dimensions of ABA that Bear, Wolf, and Risley articulated back in '68. To the extent that this is review for some of you, it's certainly review for me. But in preparation for this, I went and read the Anderson and Kincaid article. I went back and skimmed. I've read it a bunch of times, Bear, Wolf, and Risley. I've read articles by a number of I won't get ahead of myself, but there are a number of articles that were spawned when ABA, that were published when ABA was spawned, when ABA spawned PBS. It was not a happy birth, nor an easy birth. The birth of PBS, here we go. So in the late 80s and 90s, many ABA scholars and practitioners became increasingly uncomfortable with the discipline promoting and vigorously defending the use of aversive consequences such as electric shock, water spray, and loud noises. The Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was littered with studies that demonstrated that behaviorists could manipulate the environment, particularly through the use of aversive consequences to demonstrate experimental control over the frequency, duration, or intensity of behaviors. Behaviors were very proud of themselves that they could demonstrate experimentally these behavioral principles. And there was, to a certain extent, an over-reliance on aversive consequences to demonstrate that that experimental control. These scholars were also concerned that ABA interventions were too often done to rather than with individuals with disabilities. You've got to understand that this coincided with the advent of deinstitutionalization and the idea that individuals with disabilities had been horribly treated and mistreated in our country, and that we were at one point advocating for humane treatment within the community. But at the same time, we were exposing these people to these kinds of interventions, which seemed logically and morally inconsistent. They believed the use of aversives was indefensible because new technologies such as antecedent strategies that prevent behavior problems and differential reinforcement strategies that grow desired behavior that's incompatible with undesirable behavior. The advent of knowledge about so-called differential reinforcement made this over-reliance on aversive consequences unnecessary and unnecessarily dehumanizing. In 1990, did you know that Rob Horner was, I didn't, literally, and numerous colleagues, and the reason I put numerous, I think there's like 10 people on the publication, and there are a lot of names you would know. I remember Wayne Saylor. I don't know if George is on there. But you'd recognize many of the names from the literature, wrote a paper toward a technology of non-aversive support, and in it they used the phrase positive behavioral support, and it stuck. More, Aaron?
Oh, this is really great. Does everyone want to just take a minute, and do you have any questions or comments? All right. It looks like we're good so far.
Okay.
Great.
PBIS further distanced itself from ABA by including in its definition humanizing concepts such as person-centered planning, self-determination, and quality of life. And these are broad constructs that really are difficult to operationalize in ways that can be objectively observed and measured, and many applied behavior analysts, many behaviorists were uncomfortable with these conditions. These were values-based beliefs about how we should treat people with disabilities that were not necessarily consistent with the behavioral science of behavior. And so this caused a rift in the community. But I think it's important to note, you might wonder, well, why do you sometimes see PBS and sometimes see PBIS? Well, PBS is the broader umbrella term. PBIS is a multi-tiered articulation of that broader movement called PBS. That was applied again. And really, frankly, PBIS is largely came into effect as the interaction between George and Rob, George Sagai and Rob Horner. Rob had a background, the vast majority of his very stellar early research career was single subject with individuals with intellectual disabilities and or autism spectrum disorders. He was not working with whole schools. He was doing single subject research. George, on the other hand, was in schools. George's background was students with emotional behavior disorders. He was in schools. They recognized that oftentimes the context in which interventions were applied for individuals was affected by the overall context of the school, and together that led to them thinking about we need to broaden our understanding of the environmental variables that affect whether an intervention is going to be able to be delivered appropriately in ways that have the desired effect. Let me say just before I go on to this, the advent of PBIS and the people who lined up behind it, not all those who subscribed to ABA left the ship, the mothership. And so it led to a rift in the between those who thought that PBS was non-scientific and added no real advantages and resented the articulation or the characterization of ABA as inhumane. There are people who would say we don't need PBS. ABA has all the things, always had all the things. We were never cruel masters. We always had an interest in preventive antecedent interventions. We were always stressed respect and the social for the individuals who were receiving our interventions. We've always stressed the social validity of the outcomes, the improvement, the functional improvement in the quality of the life, right? That those weren't new concepts, that they were just more amplified by PBS, and that PBS in and of itself added nothing new to the science of behavior. The split between the two was acrimonious and made for great reading in the literature, which I had not done until I prepared for this. And if you're interested, I don't know, Aaron, maybe we can, I haven't yet. I have the stuff I read, on both sides, and you can read between the lines that people are really restraining themselves. It's almost like, you would see on a political blog site today where people are, going after each other. They tried to restrain themselves and be professional, but it was pretty acrimonious. And the fact of the matter is that PBS won. And PBS is far more influential within schools as PBIS, but is also informed practice in community-based mental health services, in juvenile justice, and social welfare. And so those people who were on that side of the but it isn't as though the people who promoted PBS abandoned the applied behavioral analytic principles of learning. They took it with them. So if you recall back on the second slide where I quoted Horner and Sagai, who were PBS advocates breaking away, in a sense, from ABA, they took ABA with them. And so that's in that very second slide where there's a quote from Horner and Sagai saying, yes, PBIS is an application of ABA. You can see that it wasn't a divorce, it was a reorganization. So the impact of behavior analysis on PBS is most clear in the emphasis on operational definitions of behavior and intervention elements, the logic model, and that used to select environmental manipulations designed to alter student and staff behavior, an unrelenting commitment to measurement of both the intervention fidelity and implementation fidelity, and the impact of PBS on student outcomes. And two themes that distinguish PBIS from other applications of ABA are a focus on the whole school as the unit of intervention and the multiple tiers. Erin, stop, proceed.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you just want to give people a minute to think about that information.
While you're thinking, I will just say this took me longer to put together than this was not a presentation I had in the can. I made it specifically, I borrowed from other things that I've done, obviously, but I ended up spending time that I thought I would building the PowerPoint, reading the articles. And it was fascinating to go back into it and understand more deeply the evolution of the field and where it is we're standing. It's very easy to have a very narrow view of PBIS as this thing that was always here, but to really deeply understand where it came from and what its roots are. I've been at this a long time. I still found it enriching and expanding of my facility, my comfort, my fluency with understanding what it is we're doing with PBIS. Okay?
Okay, I think you're all set. The
rest of the time that we're going to spend talking, we're going to talk about that logic model used to select environmental manipulations, which we call, if you think of the ubiquitous Venn diagram that is in every PBIS presentation, the overlapping diagrams of data, practices, and systems, which has been embellished with the references to appropriate cultural relevance for each of those. We're really going to be taking a look at the practices part and how ABA-based practices infuse each of the tiers within PBIS, not just Tier 3. Okay, so there is the logic model. How'd I do, Erin? You like that one better than the one I had yesterday? Right, so this is the basic behavioral pathway, the logic model, that it is an articulation of behavioral theory, and it is the approach to understanding the behavior that applied behavior analysts rely on. Right, we're concerned with problem behavior, the environmental conditions that give rise to that behavior, the consequences in the environment that occur as a result of that behavior, and the function that those consequences serve. So when we look at that behavioral pathway, you may be inclined or immediately be encouraged to think about Tier 3, functional behavior assessment, behavior intervention plans, because that is the basic foundation of both doing FBA and writing BIPs. But what we want to look at today is the extent to which this way of understanding human behavior really informs supports at all three tiers. Before we do that, I want to take you through a quick walk of each of the component parts of the behavior pathway. Right, some thoughts about behavior. All behavior is learned. Other than that, controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and even autonomic behaviors can be shaped via environmental feedback. You can slow your heart rate. You can bring your blood pressure down volitionally. You can do those things with biofeedback. So I just want to stress the fact that for behaviorists, learned and having a reinforcement history are synonymous. That behavior is learned precisely because it has historically been reinforced, thus operant conditioning. What we identify as inappropriate behavior is a reflection of the student's learning history, a learning error, if you will, and the student's best attempt to deal with whatever given environment, there's a Freudian slip, if you will, environmental demands. Theory tells us that behaviors exist in a given person's repertoire because that person has been reinforced for using them, and they assume they will continue to be reinforced for using them again. Target problem behaviors need to be defined in directly observable, measurable ways. Simple action verbs. It's sort of the antithesis of going to graduate school where you learn multisyllabic language to describe. So we want to talk about hitting, not aggression. We want to talk about being out of chair rather than impulsive, right? So we want to use hits and kicks, not aggressive, blurts out without permission, not impulsive, and so on. For every behavior, this is the key. This is what, as behavior specialists, this is what you're there to do primarily. This is the heart and soul of what we're doing as with PBIS. For every behavior we want the student to stop doing, the so-called B-, we need to specifically identify and directly teach the behavior we want the student to do instead, the so-called B+, and here's the rub. For behavior change to occur when we're relying on this theoretical foundation, a replacement behavior must be more efficient and effective than the B- we want the student to use instead. The efficiency of a behavior is how hard do I have to work to trigger the environmental reaction that I find rewarding? How much time, effort, and energy do I have to put into the behavior to evoke the environmental response that I find rewarding or reinforcing? Effective is how much reinforcement do I get? And if we don't get that correct in schools, learning or behavior change, which are synonymous, will not occur. So if we give students earnest lectures about why it's wrong and we appeal to their sense of fairness, and or we threaten them with harsh consequences and we send them back out into the world in which their troubling target behavior is both more efficient and effective, they will not change, they will not abandon it and adopt the new behaviors. So our jobs within PBIS is to work with teachers and support them and school personnel in creating environments in which the behavior change we want to see is more efficient and effective than what the students are currently doing. This is true, so by the way, for your attempts to shape the behavior of the adults in the building. If what you're asking them to do, if the adult behaviors that comprise PBIS aren't perceived by those adults as more efficient and effective than what they're currently doing, if we ask them to, if what they experience what we ask them to do as too intrusive or too demanding or too uncomfortable because they're not familiar with the procedures, and because they don't engage in those behaviors well, they don't get a taste of the reinforcing effect that we hope they would get if they did engage in those behaviors. They don't adopt the behavior change. The adults in the building's behavior is subject to the same lawful principles. So when we work with teachers who have been doing X for 20 years, and we come along and say, aren't you lucky we're here to get you to do Y instead? That Y needs to be more efficient and effective uh,
Kevin,
what they're doing. Yep.
Can you please go back and redefine in your last bullet efficient and effective in the context of what you're speaking of?
Okay, so efficiency of a behavior is the effort required to do it, right? How loud do I have to yell? How hard do I have to smash my desk? How many papers do I have to rip up? How long do I have to stop around the classroom? How animated, how much, right? How much effort, time, and energy goes into doing the behavior? How much do I, of my own time, effort, and energy, do I invest into doing the behavior? Is it a demanding thing that I have to really work hard at to trigger the environmental reaction I want? Or is it an easy thing for me to do? And the fact is, most troubling behavior we work on with students is relatively easy for them because they've been doing it for a long time and they're highly fluent at it. In fact, if we can introduce a cognitive concept, they do it with so-called automaticity. They don't even engage working memory in doing these behaviors. It goes right from long-term memory to behavioral output because they're so fluent at them, so that most behaviors we're trying to change for most people are very efficient for them, don't take much effort because they've been doing them for a long time. They've mastered them. So again, efficiency is how much time, effort, and energy the individual has to expend in order to get the environment to react in the way that they find reinforcing, right? To seduce that reinforcement out of the environment. The effectiveness is how much reinforcement do they get? A little bit, a hugely satisfying amount. We can't ask people to engage in behaviors. We can for people who have self-regulation and self-discipline. You cannot always do the easiest, most rewarding thing. You can self-regulate yourself through those impulses. But when we expect change of a habitual behavior, if we don't make the right, so this is why a child who tantrums, and I'm using non-behavioral language, but who tantrums to escape work, giving us a break card is more efficient and effective. It's easier than the tantrum, and every single time it pays off with escaping the work. The kid uses the break card, we nod at him and let him escape every single time. The tantrum works sometimes, but not others. It wasn't as effective. It wasn't as efficient, it wasn't effective. I don't know. Is that clear enough?
I think that was helpful.
That is the rub of what we're doing. We are working with schools to create environments in which desirable behavior is made more efficient and effective, whether at Tier 1, 2, or 3. That is exactly what PBIS endeavors to do, is to create environments in which desired behavior is the most efficient and effective way to behave. And what we know is in many schools, it's not. Desirable behavior gets ignored. Undesirable behavior gets responded to, right? So we get theory backwards often, right? When teacher attention meant to scold and redirect and encourage with the idea that the student won't do this as much in the future if I scold you, actually serves the inverse to, right, when we react to undesirable behavior. It serves to reinforce that behavior. So really that's what we're trying to do with PBIS, is engineer environments in which desired behavior is more efficient and effective than undesired behavior. That's it in a nutshell. It really is. And we do that through a variety of techniques, through prevention, teaching, reinforcement, and extinction techniques, which is where we're going. Setting events, the next element of the behavioral pathway, they are observable and measurable characteristics of the environment. They exist in the environment prior to the occurrence of the access to the antecedent. Sometimes they can really happen simultaneously. If the setting event is whether Brewer or Quinn gives the student the directive, and Brewer gets compliance and Quinn gets noncompliance, and the antecedent is the directive and the setting event is whether it's Quinn or Brewer, then temporarily distant from the antecedent, physically distant from the antecedent.
Kevin, I'm sorry, Kevin, I don't want to interrupt you with speaking about setting events, but I think the question that came up is a little bit more related to the definitions that you just gave in the last slide. The question, and we often hear this a lot, and I think you know where I'm going to go with this, is that when we use things like a break card as an option or having children escape work or be removed from the setting.
Teachers don't find it acceptable.
Yes. The question is, would you then go into speaking about fading, or would you continue on the path that you were talking? And to clarify the question, it says, can you speak to, or how can we encourage the mindsets of our teachers when talking about replacement behaviors? Or is that something that you're going to get into a little bit further? I think there's kind of a twofold question there.
Well, a little bit later in terms of when we do the webinar on teaching replacement behaviors.
Right.
It's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. If we were going to keep the answer to that question and put that question on the pathway, the teacher behavior, the B-, the troubling target behavior we want to change is the teacher's rejection of the recommended intervention. Right? What are the conditions that we've created that the teacher is going to find? Why will if we want to in a theoretically sound way, explain the teacher behavior using the exact same principles that we explain the students' behaviors with it. These principles apply to all of us. So one answer that's in keeping with the theme of today would be to say, well, put the teacher's behavior on the pathway and find out what are the conditions that are likely to trigger that behavior, and and how is that teacher reinforced for being resistant to the use of a break card. And then come up with an intervention based on that understanding of why the teacher does what the teacher does. Sometimes when we apply these principles to ourselves or to adults, that sounds a little condescending, I know, sort of patronizing. Teachers might say it's not fair. You might say back to a teacher, fairness isn't everybody getting what they need, fairness isn't everyone getting the same thing, fairness is everyone getting what they need. And if you show the teacher that, something, right, so now I'm sort of moving off the pathway, but like to argue with the teacher almost, or to lobby the teacher to change, and show them that the break card is temporary. I suppose I would ask the teacher, why are we building a BIP for this student? And I'll bet the target behavior is that really concerns the teacher is not the student not doing the work. It's the manner in which the student has learned to escape the work, right? The teacher's not all upset about the child being in his or her classroom because the child escapes the work. It's the way they escape the work. They escape the work in a toxic, noxious, intrusive way. And that's what makes the child's presence in the classroom untenable from the teacher's perspective. And so the teacher needs to understand the pathway. The first step is let's get rid of the toxic, noxious, aversive, intrusive behaviors. And then we'll get the kid to start doing his work. I don't know how else that I have any magic wand about that. I don't know, Erin, if you want to chime in.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I like you're pulling in the connection to putting the teacher's behavior on the pathway, because then it helps explain or give way to different problem solving and different ways of working and thinking about how to communicate with the teacher, because the same thing that happens with students, we want to figure out what's the most effective and efficient way for the teacher to be able to want to work with us and work with the student. And I like what you mentioned about it's not that the student's not completing the assignment or not, it's the way that they are going about doing it. It's the behavior that they're exhibiting, which the teacher is probably trying to avoid, and the easiest way for the teacher to do that is to either send them out of the classroom or punish them in some way. So I like your connections between making it explicit what behavior it is that we're trying to change, and then how we can apply that with our workings with.
Right. The most pressing goal has to be the toxic behavior.
Right.
And then we'll get on to, right? So the break card is the initial approximation of the replacement behavior. Quietly doing your work like all the other kids is the desired behavior, right? So a good BIP gets you gradually through shaping and fading, as you alluded to, from the desired behavior. But, I mean, that's a complicated topic in and of itself, how a BIP morphs over time from being how the scaffolding that a BIP provides is systematically dismantled over time might be a complete webinar in and of itself. But I get that the other thing I would say about this is if we believe that all students can learn, then I think it's important to believe, too, that students don't fail. Interventions fail students. If that student's not learning or making progress, it's because either we haven't chosen a goal that's achievable for them or we haven't implemented the right intervention with integrity. Because we believe all students can learn and make progress. And if they're not, it must be because of something, the responsibilities on our side. All right? I apply that same logic to the teacher. Teachers don't fail. Systems fail teachers. What is it we're not doing to put that teacher in a position to successfully implement best practices? And in my head, I've told you this for a long time, Aaron, I have this paper I would like to write called A Teacher's Functional Behavioral Assessment of a School Team's Failure to Implement a BIP with Integrity. Right? To put the failure to implement the BIP on the behavior pathway. The failure to implement the BIP becomes the target behavior that we explain using the same theory. Well, what were the conditions that precipitated not doing the BIP? How was the team rewarded for not doing the BIP? So that, again, these theories, and I think it goes back to the teacher, who doesn't want to do a simple intervention. It's the same idea for the larger BIP. All right. So the characteristics of setting events, I think it's important to know what they are. Setting events can be a complicated term for a couple of reasons, one of which it has the word setting in it, so it invites people to think it's necessarily the setting. Well, it might be. It might be whether you're in this room or in that room or at home or at school. But really by setting, we mean priming the pump, setting the table. So we need to work through our mind on that. I can't tell you how many students have said back to me setting events are the setting in which the behavior occurs. It's not that simple. Setting events can be people. They can be aspects of the instruction, as we'll see in a moment. Setting events, so I've said they're observable and measurable. They exist in the environment prior, typically, to the presence of the antecedent and the targeted behavior. They are functionally related to the target behavior in that the antecedent triggers the targeted behavior when the setting event is present and does not trigger the target behavior when it is not present. Here's a piece of my newer learning that you might find interesting. Well, why and how does the setting event operate on the antecedent? Well, the setting event becomes more operational when the individual believes that the consequence they're likely to get will be satisfyingly rewarding. So if I'm thirsty, the setting event, and I encounter a cold glass of water, the antecedent, I'm more likely to pick it up and drink it because I will find doing so very reinforcing. On the other hand, if I've just consumed a bottle of Arizona tea and I come across that same bottle of water, I don't pick it up because it won't be reinforcing. In a school setting, that might be the setting event is a student has gone without contact with the teacher for an extended period of time. The antecedent is independent work. The student engages in misbehavior in order to attract teacher attention, right? That's called the deprivation state. One of the things that often makes the consequence appear more valuable and desirable to the individual is they haven't experienced it for a while, and so they're in a deprived state of it. It's why we get hankerings for certain kinds of food after we haven't had it for a while, and you can think of many analogies. for me, I think this is critical learning, that setting events have a direct connection to consequences, even though consequences is at the far end of the behavioral pathway on the right and setting events on the left. What makes setting events operational, what makes them so-called establishing operations, is the fact that when those conditions are in place, the individual believes the consequence will be particularly rewarding. So if you go back to Brewer and Quinn, if Brewer gives the directive and they engage in inappropriate behavior, the student's not going to misbehave because Brewer knows what she's doing and she's not going to reinforce me for misbehavior. But Quinn is stumbling blindly through his teaching. So when he gives the directive, if I misbehave, he'll engage me and get me right. So in that way, the learner sees, oh, when it's Brewer, misbehavior is not likely to lead to a reinforcing consequence. When it's Quinn, i.e. the setting event, misbehavior is likely to be highly reinforcing because Quinn is prone to power struggles and arguments, and I find all that very reinforcing. So for me, I for a long time had been teaching that setting events operate on antecedents, and that when the setting event is present, the antecedent is more likely to trigger the behavior. But I didn't understand the mechanism through which that happened. So that's relative, and that's why I'm excited about it and spending this much time on it. Maybe that's old hat to you guys, but to me it was pretty exciting to add that piece of understanding to my understanding of the pathway. I also think that sometimes it's difficult to discriminate what's the setting event versus what's the antecedent. And I think you can ask yourself the question, well, which of the events in the environment make it more like, or making it the individual perceive the consequences as particularly rewarding at this point. And then that's the answer to what the setting event is. Setting events, therefore, are said to operate on antecedents because they make the antecedent operational, more likely to trigger the behavior. Here's a whole bunch of examples. Smart people have been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and these are your standard setting events. Any questions?
Hold on. Yes, Kevin, there is one question. Does a setting event must be there in order to trigger the behavior?
No.
Okay. Or
well, here's a better answer to that. Okay. Setting events are harder to identify than antecedents because they frequently are temporally and distally further from the occurrence of the behavior. A setting event could be conflict at home in the morning. That's hard to assess whether it happened or not. The only thing we can do is triage in the morning and ask the kid how his morning was. Conflict on the bus, being teased in the hallway before the child walked into your classroom, coming in hungry. Those are harder things to assess than the immediate environmental variables that trigger the behavior because that's right in front of you. I would argue, right? So if you look at the phrase at the bottom of the slide that's up now, setting events help us explain why the antecedent triggers the behavior sometimes, but not at other times. And so unless the antecedent literally triggers the behavior every single time, right, there must be a setting event, right? So if you have a variable reaction to the antecedent, and sometimes the antecedent triggers the behavior and sometimes it doesn't, as long as you've defined that antecedent accurately, identified it accurately, there must be a setting event because it's the setting event that's determining whether the antecedent triggers the behavior or not. So hypothetically and theoretically, does there have to be one? No, but I would think if you're going to say no, it would have to mean that the antecedent triggers the behavior every single time because it's the setting event that affects whether the antecedent is 100% likely to trigger the behavior. On the other hand, you can do an FBA and not have a setting event. You can write a BIP without any setting event identified. You can write summary statements that don't include setting events because in an objective way you were unable to identify what it is. So you can't intervene if you don't know what it is. You know something out there in the world is affecting whether they respond this way or that way, but your investigation, your data collection techniques have not unearthed what it is. And that's not unusual. And here's where I get in trouble, Aaron, because I know in practice and in scholarship, proceeding with just the ABC is permissible, but I'm not sure what New York regs say.
I think they like to identify a sending event.
Right. Right. And so my sense is that there's as much problem enforcing identification of a setting event and getting it wrong as there is in not identifying it at all. Right? So if you write one just because that puts you in compliance, but you're not sure it's really functionally related to the behavior, I'm not sure that that's wise. But they are more difficult to identify than the antecedent because of their distance from the problem behavior. Frequently, their distance from the problem behavior. As I said, the setting event could be right there in the classroom or in the hallway or in the moment, too. It doesn't have to be a half hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or yesterday away in time and space. Okay?
Okay. Are there any other questions on setting events? Because I'm assuming you're transitioning to antecedents next.
I am.
Good student I am. I think what we're going to do is would everyone be comfortable with a 5-minute stretch break? Just so that you can get up. It might take us a little bit over the 12 o'clock, but if you could just let me know in the chat if you're okay with that, or if you would continue or prefer that he would continue. Okay, so I'm seeing a yes. Yes. Fine either way. Yes meaning we're good, or do you want me to continue? I don't know what that means. Continue? Continue. Okay, good here. So let's continue. That's good because I was worried that I didn't know how to pause the recording. So let's continue with antecedents and move on from here.
Okay, antecedents like setting events are observable and measurable events in the environment that can be objectively, reliably, validly identified. They too are present in the environment prior to the occurrence of behavior, and they have that direct functional cause-effect relationship to the behavior, and we use words like trigger and elicit antecedents, trigger and elicit behaviors. Smart people have been thinking about standard antecedents when we go into environments. Might be aspects of location, things like density of people, type of lighting, noise levels, particularly for kids on the spectrum and kids with I don't know if any of you have hypersensitivity to. I don't like clocks that you can hear the ticking of, or when overhead lights get that hum, or on the other hand, there are other noises. Right outside my window, there's a busy campus, and every so often it's flooded with students between classes, and I barely notice the change. Right now it's quiet. For 15 minutes it'll be noisy as it floods, and I have habituated to that stimulus outside my window. So I'm not particularly, I don't do well in crowds, however. Activity, is it a non-preferred, a long, boring, lengthy, passive? Natures of the task, is it new? How many errors am I going to make? How hard is it for me to do? And then instruction is huge. Listen, it's not an FBA presentation, but an considerable amount, a significant amount of troubling behavior at school is triggered by asking kids to do work that's too hard for them, by work for which they haven't mastered the necessary prerequisites. And then what happens in time is even when you do teach students in the zone of proximal development, right where they're ready to learn, they don't even take the time to discriminate that you've done so. They've just learned to assume that any academic demand is an opportunity for failure and humiliation and frustration, so they avoid it. So there are any number of aspects of instruction that trigger behavior, and in many, many BIPs, though it's a BIP for social behavior, it involves differential instruction on the academic side, so as not to trigger the behavior. And then teacher directives are a big one. You know, if we didn't have to ask kids or tell kids what to do, they wouldn't misbehave a lot of times if we left them to their own devices. Except for those attention methods, right? If we leave them to their own devices, they misbehave to get us to come running. Any questions about antecedents? Moving on. Consequences. They too are observable and measurable events in the environment, though I have a question about that I'll bring up later. They occur following behavior. They are functionally related to behavior in that the behavior is said to prompt or evoke the environmental consequence, the response or reaction in the environment. Their functional relationship to behavior can be said another way. Consequences that are prompted by a given behavior may in turn serve one of two purposes or functions. It may sustain or strengthen that behavior through reinforcement, or it may weaken or suppress that behavior through strategies such as extinction and punishment. Sometimes people think consequence is synonymous with punishment. It's not. A consequence can be either behavior strengthening or a consequence can be behavior weakening, depending on which kind of consequence it is, reinforcement or extinction punishment. Questions about here's some standard consequences that you'll see: teacher attention, peer attention, being ignored or left alone. Being ignored or left alone is an interesting one because it looks like nothing. Right? You look at it and you say, oh, nothing's happening. Well, maybe that's what the child wanted, for nothing from the environment to be coming at him or her. Being sent away, getting a toy or a good grade or a PBIS ticket, a satisfying level of physical activity, which is where I have a hard time staying consistent with my previous slide where I said consequences are observable, measurable phenomenon in the environment. More on that in a moment. All right, so behaviors make things simple for us. All right, so that's consequences. That's the fourth noun in the behavioral pathway, right? If we think about the behavioral pathway, what goes in the rectangles are nouns, what connects them, the arrows are verbs. It's important to know both, right? I haven't made that explicit, but I've said setting events operate on antecedents. Antecedents trigger behavior. Behavior evoke consequences. Consequences serve functions. And in that instance, I've labeled each of the nouns, and I've stated the relationship to them by identifying the verbs between them. And to really understand the model, you need to know the nouns and the verbs. So I'm finishing consequences, and I'm going to the fifth component, which is function. It is very easy, and I still fall prey to this all the time, to conflate, to combine consequence and function. Terms like teacher attention, sure, that's an observable, measurable thing I can see. That's the consequence. Well, then what's the function? Teacher attention. Oh, well, why am I using the same words for two different phenomenon, function? And, right, so if we really want to be precise in our thinking, the consequence is teacher's physical what word am I looking for? Physical proximity and verbal interaction. What function does that serve? Teacher attention, right? Because the environment is something that I don't have to make an inference. The consequence is something I don't have to make an inference about. It's observable and measurable. I do have to make an inference about the function. So at the back end of the behavioral pathway, these are two distinct concepts, consequence and function. But I guarantee you, read examples of summary statements. This child does these behaviors under these conditions to get this reaction. And people will write this reaction, and they will blend the consequence and the function. There will be a distinct statement for the antecedent. There will be a distinct statement for the setting event. There will be a distinct statement for the behavior. But then they will conflate consequence and function. And I would urge you, I don't think it's a critical error, but for the sophistication of our own thinking, to deconstruct that conflation and instead say, in order to get have the teacher verbally reprimand him, which serves the teacher attention function. I got a little bit ahead of myself because here's the function. Behaviors make it easy for us. We all do what we do for one of two basic reasons: to get or obtain something we want, or to escape, avoid something we don't want. I don't know why we use the term both get, obtain, because they are both literally synonymous, but when you look at escape, avoid, they are not. And I will reference Joe Otter for my learning in this area. Joe explained the difference to me between escape and avoid. Escape means that the thing in the environment's already here and I want it to go away. Avoid means I never want to let it get into the environment. They're slightly different. It's another discrimination that I think is worth making. In get, obtain, the individual gets or obtains something he or she finds desirable or rewarding, such as attention, tangible activity, or object. Same in escape, avoid. So if you can look at the 6 bullets at the bottom, attention on both sides, tangible on both sides, stimulation on both sides, you'll see that there's really 6 reasons why we all do what we do. 6 functions for all of our behavior, all human behavior, all mammal behavior, all animal behavior is maintained by some combination of those 6 things, according from the behavioral perspective anyway. It's the stimulation function that I worry about because in stimulation, individuals who engage in so-called stereotypical behavior, rocking, flapping, biting, many others, often engage in it in the get, obtain. They are understimulated. They have no demands placed on them. They have nothing to do. So they start rocking in order to obtain a preferred level of physical stimulation. Where I struggle with my definition of consequence there is, then what's the consequence for this stimulation behavior? What are they getting out of the environment? They're not. They're getting an internal state that they find desirable. The same is true on the escape avoid side. In situations where some individuals, particularly individuals on the spectrum or with intellectual disabilities, when they are overstimulated by noise or demands or crowds of people, they will engage in so-called stereotypical behavior in order to escape from that overload of stimulation. If any of you are doodling while you're listening to this and drawing in the margins of something or tapping your foot or doing that's your preferred level of stimulation. Those are socially acceptable, self-regulatory activities that fit perfectly into this category. You're understimulated, sitting at a computer listening to me drone on. You need more stimulation than that. You start tapping your foot. You start doodling in the margin of the paper on your desk. You start multitasking. You start reading your text on the phone, right? Because you're looking for that greater stimulation. And again, in my own thinking, my slide for consequences says that the consequence is always observable and measurable event in the environment, I think, except when the function is a preferred level of stimulation. I guess you could argue that a flapping hand now exists in the environment. And maybe that's more refined, and I shouldn't belabor that, but that's where I am in my thinking of trying to be consistent, trying to be logical, trying to be accurate. That's one of the things I'm contemplating about my own learning. Here's another articulation of the same functions. We have the problem behavior. We have the 2 obtain, get, or escape, avoid. We have, for each of those, we have stimulation, social, and tangible. And then for social, it can be further broken down into adult or peer, pretty straightforward. You've probably got that slide in your FBA presentation. And here are some common functions: peer attention, adult attention, obtaining a desired activity, a desired object, preferred level of stimulation, and a similar list on the other side. Any questions about any of the components of the behavioral pathway, how they work together, right? The behavioral pathway is a theoretically sound articulation of why behavior occurs. Behavior occurs under certain circumstances, because when it is allocated under those circumstances are what we call setting events and antecedents, because the individual expects to get reinforced for using that behavior under those circumstances. That is a behaviorally sound, a theoretically sound explanation for behavior, a defendable theory of action. And that's what the behavioral pathway is an articulation of behaviorism, of behavioral theory, of applied behavior analysis. Any questions?
Kevin, just to explicitly say what you just said, so when you called it a theoretically sound, it means that it is grounded in theory and research, so it is a best practice, correct?
That's correct. All right. interventions that are based on the behavioral pathway. When we explain behavior along the behavioral pathway, we have a theoretically sound explanation for behavior, and once we have a sound theoretical grounding, we can then select evidence-based practices to let that theory inform our selection of evidence-based practices. And that's called building the BIP. Except we don't only do it with the BIP. We do it at Tier 1, too, and that's what the other purpose of this presentation is to show that the behavioral pathway is alive and well on Tier 1, too. It doesn't just show up in FBAs and BIPs. That's where we're going. Hypotheses, all three get-obtained functions are said to fall under the positive reinforcement hypotheses. All escape-avoid functions are said to fall under the negative reinforcement hypotheses. So again, in my mind, I tried to make three fine discriminations. I have three concepts at the back end of the behavioral pathway. I have consequences, the environmental event that serves to maintain the behavior. I have the function, the purpose of the behavior that I infer from the A, the B, and the C. The antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And then I have which hypothesis does the function fall under. So I have three distinct concepts: consequences, functions, and hypotheses at the end of the behavioral pathway. Summary statements are theoretically sound explanations of the environmental conditions that predict and maintain targeted behaviors. What we're talking about, they have a distinct format. When these setting events and or antecedents are present in the environment, the student is more likely to engage in the targeted behavior in order to evoke this consequence, which serves that function. So you notice in my example there, in order to evoke this consequence is the consequence piece, and then I have a separate statement for the function. In reality, when I start writing those out in summary statements for real kids, I frequently conflate them into teacher attention or escape work, right? And what I should say for escape work is sent to the office. That's the observable, measurable thing I saw. The inference I'm making is he wanted to escape work. Summary statements provide the context for building behavioral support, and the point of this little talk is that it provides the context for building behavioral support not just at Tier 3, but at Tiers 1, 2, and 3. And as behavior specialists, we want you to fluently see how the behavioral pathway is at work across all three tiers. So we're really looking at the intersection of the behavioral pathway and the multi-tiered system of support known as PBIS. And so the question is, can we make explicit the ways in which we put the behavioral pathway to work for us when we provide support at all three tiers? And that is, could we actually write a summary statement that indicate how the behavioral pathway is at work beneath the supports we provide at Tiers 1, 2, and 3, rather than just save summary statements for BIPs at Tier 3, right? Can we really put Tier 1 on the behavioral pathway and then come up with a summary statement that says the vast majority of kids will engage in these desirable behaviors if we create these environmental conditions because they're likely to get reinforced in these ways that serve this function. So this slide is there to hopefully help you see that when we talk about setting event and antecedent interventions, we're talking about preventative strategies. When we talk about intervening at the behavioral component of the behavioral pathway, we're talking about teaching or instructional strategies. And when we're talking about intervening with regard to consequence and function, we're talking about reinforcement and, reinforcement and extinction strategies. All right, and so under prevention strategies, our goal is to make problem behavior irrelevant. That's another term you'll frequently hear with regard to FBAs and BIPs, but it is true at the other levels as well, as we'll see in a moment. By irrelevant, we mean we make problem behavior irrelevant because the conditions under which the student has learned the troubling behavior will be highly reinforcing are never encountered. We round all of our edges. We remove the triggers from the environment for trouble that cue the student to say, hey, if you engage in the troubling behavior now, you're likely to get a really juicy dosage of reinforcement. We construct environments that don't send those invitations, that don't send cues to the student, that now is a good time to use that troubling behavior because it's likely to pay off for you in a very effective way. Instead, we load the environment with cues to engage in appropriate behavior, because in doing that, you will in fact encounter really juicy reinforcing consequences. So for preventive strategies, we remove triggers and we introduce cues, prompts, and we remove triggers for troubling behavior and introduce, right? So, and again, this looks like a worksheet for a BIP, but in fact, it articulates what we're doing at Tier 1 and in Tier 2 too, as we'll see in a minute. At teaching strategies, we're going to teach behaviors that are more efficient and effective, whether at Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3, in maintaining, in obtaining the maintaining consequence of the problem behavior. And then at the consequence and reinforcement end, we want to make sure that we use differential reinforcement so that desired behavior gets a nice thick schedule of reinforcement, and the behavior that's inconsistent with our criteria of acceptable performance does not get inadvertently reinforced. And the fact of the matter is there's all sorts of free-floating reinforcement in schools available for students who are making inappropriate choices, and we need to detox the school of those things. Any questions about that? All right, the goal here is to really be clear that setting event and antecedent strategies are preventive strategies, that the behavior component involves explicit instruction in desired behavior, regardless of the tier, and that at all three tiers we're clever about how we manipulate consequences in order to reinforce desirable behavior and put undesirable behavior at the very least on extinction. Any questions?
Not in the chat right now.
So the critical features of behavior support, therefore, include teaching desired behavior, preventing problem behavior, reinforcing desired behavior, extinguishing problem, and then I add suppression there because, right, that's really aversive consequences. And if you remember back to our story about how we got here, we talked about how aversive consequences were the springboard to positive behavior supports, but the fact of the matter is that we still use techniques like timeout, we still use response cost, we still use extinction, and those are meant to be aversive consequences that suppress future occurrences of troubling behavior. Teachers still scold kids in school. If we say we don't use aversive consequences in school, then no teacher can scold any kid. So aversive consequences still exist, just not the highly controversial, intrusive ones. Timeout is an aversive consequence that's meant to suppress future occurrences of behavior, and I suppose we could it's not punishment per se, it's the absence of reinforcement, but on another day we can get into all those. So whether most people only say teach, prevent, reinforce, extinguish. Part of my learning has been, there's all these other technologies out there that are evidence-based, but they're at the punishment end of things. Why aren't we talking about them? Are we outlawing them? And the answer is no, we're not outlawing them. We're just using them only as a modest component of our support relative to the effort and energy we put into teaching, preventing, reinforcing, and extinguishing. Okay, so here's the rub of what we've gone to. I think there's only 3 or 4 more slides. So at Tier 1, where is the pathway? And Tier 1 is school-wide behavioral supports for all kids. We've got our articulation of prevention strategies. You probably all have new team training or whatever we're calling it these days. You've done new team training. You live with that. So if we deconstruct that into the behavioral pathway, what does Tier 1 look like? Well, Tier 1, and maybe, here's what I would ask you. I did make these slides for this presentation. If you can think of other bullets that should go in these columns, I'll have to use a smaller font, but I would love to hear them. Other aspects of school-wide PBIS that fit either the preventive, the teaching, or the consequence strategy components of the behavioral pathway. So in Tier 1, what are the aspects of the supports we provide that constitute preventive setting event strategies? Well, we publicly post signs of school-wide, be respectful, be safe, or whatever, roar, whatever clever way schools identify to articulate their 3, 4, 5 School-wide behavioral expectations are posted all throughout the school, and the posting of those signs constitute a setting of an intervention because the student learns, oh, that's right. In the presence of these signs, if I engage in pro-social behavior, I'm really highly likely to get recognized and acknowledged for doing it, and I might even get a ticket and a trip to a special event, and right? So that the presence of that setting event cues the student that if I respond to teacher directives appropriately, I'm highly likely to get juicily reinforced. That is not a technical term, juicily. Teachers engaged in active supervision. So when you're out at your door supervising in the halls, when you're not sitting at your own table in the cafeteria talking to one another, but are up and moving about and scanning the quality of the students' behavior in the cafeteria and giving them contingent feedback on the extent to which they are or are not meeting the behavioral expectations for the cafeteria, right? So on a very fixed schedule, you're acknowledging the kids who are doing a good job, and on a less fixed schedule, you're correcting in a very non-reinforcing way the kids who are deviating from cafeteria expectations. So you're engaged in active supervision. Your presence doing that is a setting event that cues the students, hey, if I make good choices and comply with the antecedent expectations, I'll get reinforced. Bulletin boards celebrating kids. Remind kids, hey, I'm likely to get reinforced if I make good choices too. Morning announcements that feature and privilege PBIS. Put in the child's mind, they're a cue, an environmental cue. Hey, if I make good choices. I hate the term, but I guess it's the agreed upon term. If we move over to antecedent strategies, as I'm giving my antecedent directives, if I pre-correct my expectations before I give them, that's an antecedent. And again, giving good pre-corrections is not rocket science to understand what it is, stating the expectations, restating the expectations that you taught prior to giving the directive, but building them into your teacher repertoire, giving a good pre-correct, remembering to give them and when to give them and how to give them. That clinical skill is the demanding part, not conceptually understanding what they are. And then, of course, giving explicit, unambiguous directions that students are capable of finding. Those are antecedent strategies. Then we have an articulation of the teaching strategies, right? The hallmark of Tier 1 is we have all those workshops throughout the school in which we create behavioral matrices for each of the settings that we're going to talk about. And we take our school-wide behavior expectations and we make them more objectively observable and measurable through the articulation of our behavioral matrix for that specific setting. So what does behavioral, be respectful, safe, and prepared look like in the cafeteria, in the hallway, in the bathroom, getting off the bus? In any of the common areas. And of course we do that, that's explicit instruction that relies heavily on teacher modeling of examples and non-examples, giving the students lots of guided practice and independent practice. Now we know from the literature how to teach a student to acquire new social behavior requires an articulation of many steps, deconstructed many steps. I'm not going to go through them in this webinar, but I will in another when we talk about teaching replacement behaviors. And then at the back end, we have our reinforcement and extinction strategies. So what are the reinforcement strategies? Teachers catching kids being good, a smile, a nod, a wink, a PBIS ticket. How are we implementing extinction? Well, the standard correction procedure in PBIS for kids who aren't meeting school-wide expectations is to ask them to verbally restate the expectation for talking or movement in the hallway, whatever it is you taught, then ask them to show it to you and then praise them for doing it. That's a brief, non-reinforcing correction procedure. So yes, I have to engage a non-complier to scaffold compliance, but I want to be sure that whenever I tend to noncompliance, I do so in a brief and unreinforcing way, because every time I direct my attention to noncompliance, the potential exists for my response to be experienced by the student as reinforcing, and I need to guard against that. Any questions about how the pathway is evident at Tier 1? Here's how it's evident at Tier 2. As we build our supports. And I'm selected check-in, check-out as our Tier 2 intervention because in New York State and other places, many other places in the country, check-in and check-out and Tier 2 are nearly synonymous. It's typically the first Tier 2 intervention that many schools adopt, and it's oftentimes the only Tier 2 intervention schools adopt, and so I'm using it as my example. So what's the setting event strategy? Well, meeting with the check-in, check-out coordinator in the morning, checking in with the teacher at the beginning of the class about expectations, about how points are earned, how DPR points are earned. Carrying the DPR form itself is a setting event intervention. Are we still here?
Yep, we're still here.
Okay. Explicit classroom expectations are setting event strategies that cue the student that if you make good choices, good things are going to happen. What are the antecedent strategies? Unambiguous teacher directives, teacher prompts that remind good choices that good choices will earn full DPR points and help meet goals. What drives me crazy is when a student has a check-in, check-out DPR, and the child needs to have their behavior scaffolded and supported during class, and the teacher doesn't reference the DPR in managing the student behavior. No one teaches the teacher to say to the child, Johnny, when you choose not to follow my directions the first time they're given, you'll be choosing not to earn all of your DPR points today. I know you're very motivated to reach your goals. I hope you can make good choices. Right? Nobody says anything to the kid until at the end of class they say, oh, you earned a 1 instead of a 3, right? So that DPR then becomes an antecedent intervention by which I provide a prompt to the student to make a better behavioral choice. What are the teaching strategies here at is direct instruction in the check-in, check-out procedure, and then explicit instruction in specific social skills needed to meet DPR goals. So that if there's a behavior that the student is engaging in that's going to undermine his success with the DPR, we need to teach the behavior. If it's raising a quiet hand instead of calling out, then we need direct explicit instruction and hand raising, and not just lecture the kid to stop calling out, but to actually have mini workshops teaching raising a quiet hand as a needed social skill, following appropriate social skill teaching protocols. Not just a once-off, hey, here's how you raise a quiet hand, but explicit, thoughtful, comprehensive instruction in the new behavior. What are the consequence strategies at work at Tier 2? Check out with the check-in, check-out coordinator, that attention that they get at the end of the day and get feedback about how they did, the DPR points themselves. I could add, I ran out of space, if the DPR points are a form of a contract, and if the student meets his targets on any number of days or however it's structured, they get some sort of tangible payoff above and beyond the points. You could add that in there as a reinforcement too. Teacher praise and parent praise, because of course the form goes home to inform the parent in check-in, check-out about how the child did, and the parent hopefully is trained to recognize the water that's in the glass, what the child did well, instead of berating them for what, right? And then extension, what's the extension component? Well, we've all seen, if you've seen the behavior education plan video or any of them, the admonition to not lecture the child, to not ride the child or about not having met their targets in ways that students might find unfortunately reinforcing. Any questions about the pathway at Tier 2?
Kevin, let me just reinforce for everyone that DPR is, for those not familiar with check-in, check-out, is the daily progress report. So that's the card that has the students' goals that they pick up in the morning. They're aware of what the students' goals are, whether it be safe, be ready, or whatever it is. And then for each class, it has specifically, you've operationalized what that looks like in each classroom setting, and it gives the student opportunities to systematically seek out positive reinforcement from teachers and adults on a schedule. So the daily progress report usually goes home to the parents, but more importantly, it's used to collect data so that we can see if the student is on the correct check-in, check-out plan, and that it is actually working for the student. So within 3 to 5 days, you'll have different data points where you can see whether or not the plan needs to be changed or modified based on how the student's responding.
Right? The student gets quantified feedback on the extent to which they met their goals at the end of every period, usually on a 0 to 3 scale. So if they do really well and only need modest or moderate behavioral support in the moment, they earn a 3. If they need to be redirected several times, they might earn a 2. They might choose to earn a 2. Again, I will encourage you, as I encourage everyone, in any of these systems that involve points, students always start with 0 and choose through their behavior to earn their points or not earn their points. They never start with 3 and lose. That invites the student to perceive you as taking something from them that was rightfully theirs. And instead, we want to promote personal responsibility by saying you have the opportunity to earn these points through the behavioral decisions you make, but you could also choose not to earn them by making less than positive behavioral choices. The responsibility is at the child's end, at the student's end, not at my end to take them from them. I'm just a neutral umpire, giving them objective feedback on whether they chose to behave in a way that was consistent with expectations or not. And I give them that feedback typically by letting them know that they chose. I don't give them a 3. They earned a 3. I don't give them a 1. They earn a 1. It makes a big difference. Language matters. It's a lot of little rabbit holes to go down here, Aaron, in terms of, actually teaching the interventions. So we're at Tier 3 now. This one's a little more crowded. Here's your behavioral pathway. You've conducted your FBA, and now you've got, this is your summary statement. The student will walk around the room, put head down, talk to students when given an independent task that requires writing, because the teacher then engages student and works with student one-on-one. Therefore, the function is to get the teacher's attention and also avoid the writing task through the help they're getting, and all of this is more likely to happen when the task requires writing more than 2 sentences. All right, so that would be a summary statement that resulted from an FBA. Here at Tier 3, that would become the basis by which we are building the BIP, which might look something like this. It's a little different format than the other two because there's more content now to delineate what the preventing, teaching, reinforcing, and extinguishing strategies are. Because it's a BIP now, we have reference to both the initial temporary replacement behavior as well as the long-term desired behavior. Temporary replacement behavior is to begin work given one directive, complete a chunk of the overall task, which is a small amount, maybe 1 sentence, independently and appropriately, may ask for help only once per chunk, right? So we've got the student saying, this is how much work you have to do before you can stop. When you do this much work, you can, as you'll see in a moment, you can stop and show it to an adult. That gives you both a break from doing the work and lets you get the teacher attention you want. Of course, in the long term, we want, and this is a good answer. This is really a good answer to the teacher who doesn't like the break card earlier, who wouldn't like this either because we're sanctioning doing less work, but only as an approximation towards eventually doing all the work, of course. Right, then the prevention is we're going to pre-correct the student about expectations for writing. We're going to reduce the length and difficulty of the writing task. We're going to provide a graphic organizer and choose only high-interest writing topics that the student has identified they're interested in. What's the teaching component of this intervention is provide explicit instruction in using a red Post-it note to signal need for help. So if the assignment is to write a paragraph that has to be 5 sentences long, a chunk might be 1 paragraph, at least initially. As the student gets better, the chunk might become 2 sentences, 1 sentence, then 2 sentences. So in this case, the prevent is provide explicit instruction using a red Post-it note. So the student has a green and red Post-it note. And once per chunk, whatever we define a chunk to be, let's say in this instance is a chunk is the completion of 1 full sentence, the students are allowed to put the red Post-it note out. That's a replacement behavior for walking around the room, putting head down, and talking to other students. right? And the teacher will come and attend and support briefly, right? They're not going to, you can't put the red Post-it note out and then the teacher stays there forever. They will come briefly and support. And then when they've written their sentence, they have a green Post-it note that they put out, and the teacher immediately comes and feeds the student the attention they want, right? Right. So what we're doing is we're giving the student what they want, teacher attention, but we're making it contingent upon doing some work, right? Another way to answer that teacher who's reluctant to these approaches is, would you rather maintain 100% compliance with expectations and have the student do zero work, or would you rather lower the expectation to 10% and have the student comply with a 10% expectation? Which is more work? 0% of 100% or 100% of 10% of the work? So that's another way to explain it. Of course, eventually we want the student to do 100% of the work. So is that clear about how we're giving the student what he wants in two ways? We're letting the student escape from the work by getting teacher support with a red Post-it note, and at the end of completing a chunk, we're giving the student what they want in the form of teacher attention when they signal for it with A. So you can imagine the teaching component means taking this kid out of the classroom and rehearsing this and role-playing it and letting the kid be the teacher and you be the student and you be the teacher and he be the student and so on. It's not just a once-off 30-second description of what you're going to do. The kid needs to recognize it for what it is when he has to bring it back into the real classroom and use it in the real world. The reinforcement strategy is smile and nod the student whenever they're on task, even within a chunk. Walk by their desk and nod at them, let them know that you see them doing good work. Be effusive with sprays upon chunk completion. When that green Post-it note comes out, and that might be very effusive with your praise. Arrange to have lunch with the student if he uses the new plan successfully to earn a check on 4 or 5 days. Why do we do that? Because what did the kid want? They wanted teacher attention. So we're building in yet another way that when you make good choices, you get what you want. What's the extinction component of this? If a student engages in problem behaviors, use a brief non-reinforcing prompt, a correction procedure. Do not scold or repeatedly redirect. Do not assist with writing. Task one, but the one time for the red Post-it note, inform the student he has chosen not to earn his check for the day if noncompliance continues. And just let that system, right? Again, efficiency and effectiveness. The adults responding to noncompliance with the writing expectations have to interact with the child in a manner that is far less reinforcing than when the child engages in compliance with the writing expectations. It ain't rocket science. It is, however, challenging to do in a real world in which you are multitasking. You have to be fully present in the moment, what people are increasingly calling mindful, right, so that you can self-regulate through this. The student also needs to learn that using the red Post-it note to get help is more efficient than walking around the room, putting my head down, and talking to other students. All right, so that is how the behavior pathway obviously is at work in Tier 3 interventions. So we have our ubiquitous triangle, and the point of today was to show how the behavioral pathway comprised of setting events and related prevention strategies and antecedents and related prevention strategies and behaviors and the related teaching strategies and consequence and the related reinforce extinguish strategies aren't the unique purview of Tier 3, but are in fact fundamentally the theoretical foundation on which interventions at all 3 tiers rest. Thinking functionally on the pathway is fundamental. I said that. Right? So you'll frequently hear me refer to teachers' need to develop theoretically sound, cohesive narratives in their mind to guide themselves through the moment so that they can implement these multi-component supports and be consciously aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it at any given time. So a set of questions that I like to ask my students and that I like to ask anyone who's endeavoring to shape learning or shape behavior change. What specific learning outcome, behavioral objective, am I presently actively supporting my students in achieving? What specific strategy am I using to support a positive outcome in that regard? What specific theory and accompanying evidence base makes me confident I've picked the correct supports for the desired outcome? What specific steps am I taking to ensure I'm implementing those supports with integrity? And what specific data am I collecting to assess whether the supports are indeed leading to a successful outcome? What we talked about today accounts for this part of that series of questions, right? So implementation integrity isn't really fully covered by what we talked about today. Data collection to see if what I'm doing is working isn't really fully covered in what we talked about. But they, too, are obviously incredibly important aspects of PBIS. And we have all of that integrity data that we collect in terms of BOQs and TFIs. And Aaron and I and Dorothy and Joe just spent a considerable amount of time writing the state-vetted FBA BIP curriculum, and within that curriculum are guidelines for how to assess the integrity of the implementation of the BIP, because state regs require that. So I don't want to suggest that those things aren't important. They're just not really addressed, that series of questions, by the content we've covered today. Voila, Aaron. End of webinar 1.
That was fantastic, Kevin. That was so great. I'm going to give people a minute to see if they have any questions on it. In the meantime, I am going to, I just have some of the Part 200 regulation verbiage that is related to setting events that I just posted in the chat. We mentioned it before, although setting events are not specifically mentioned in Part 200. As a practitioner, that when you go in, setting events are integral to the behavioral pathway and something that you should always be thinking about, because as Kevin showed you in the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, those are interventions, your antecedent interventions. You need to know if there is a setting event that's going to increase the likelihood of the behavior occurring that we don't want to be seeing. That will help in your antecedent intervention. So although it's not something that maybe CEQA is looking for in your professional practice, you should always be thinking in terms of the behavioral pathway, and the behavioral pathway includes the setting event. Are there any other additional questions that are related to the PowerPoint? So I'm just going to stop the PowerPoint right now, or the recording, but if you can all just hold on one moment. I want to thank Dr. Quinn for spending his morning with us, and for also the amount of time and effort he's put into this, especially in terms of the background and making those connections for us. That was all new information and great information. I think it really sets the foundation for what our work is and helps contextualize some of the ways that we go in and the work that we're doing, and also makes us seem like we're on the right path when we're doing some of our thinking, and that it's sound and based in research. So I'm going to thank you again, and I'm going to just stop the recording now.
Okay. Kids, what the most to do is actively seek their own reinforcement. I just looked at my phone for the first time, and it is exactly 12 o'clock. How about that?
Okay, all right. And on that note,
Somebody needs to know that I didn't take 2 hours to do 4 slides.
Okay.